Hello, everyone, and welcome to IAB There, our regular streaming show in which we connect the digital advertising ecosystem. My name is Eric John. I'm the Vice President of IAB's Media Center. And on today's show, we're thrilled to speak with two special guests, Vanessa Otero from Adfontes Media and Dan Granger from Oxford Road. Today, we're going to be discussing a topic near and dear to IAB's heart: brands, bias, and misinformation in the news. If you've been watching IAB's events and programming over the past couple of years, you probably are aware we've done quite a bit of research into understanding how brand safety, the adjacency of brands with news of various types, affects consumer perceptions of brands. Most recently, we produced a study called the News Trust Halo that offered some really interesting insights into how people perceive brands within the news content they're viewing. Interestingly, what we found was that when brands advertise within professionally produced news media, consumers, regardless of their gender, political background, or age, feel that that brand is more trustworthy, more relevant, and more likely to purchase that brand. So it's interesting to think about how incredibly concerned brands are, as they should be, about things like adjacency with news. But there's a bigger thing to be concerned about, and that is the actual livelihood of journalism itself. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. First, I'd like to invite into the discussion Dan Granger. Dan is founder and CEO of Oxford Road, an independent audio agency. Oxford Road has helped hundreds of direct-to-consumer companies scale their efforts in audio with podcast, radio, streaming, connected voice, and more. It was recently named Inc. 500 fastest growing private companies. Dan's also the host of the Media Roundtable, carried by Podcast One. And as a founding partner of the Media Roundtable, he's been leading the charge in understanding how to mobilize marketers to promote truth and civility in ad-supported media. So Dan, let me start with you, and then Vanessa, we're going to bring you into the conversation in a moment as well. So I was listening to Media Roundtable's Greatest Hits podcast just a week or so ago. I was not astounded, but I was just really, it was an amazing listen, because the range of voices in the mix, everyone from T-Pain to pretty far right journalists or podcasters.
You can say it, Bill O'Reilly. We can say his name. Yep.
There you go.
We run the gamut. It's really something.
I love that, because it gets to the heart of what is really a challenge right now, which is so what some refer to as the balkanization of perception around news and content. But if you could share what has been, you've been doing the Media Roundtable for roughly a year now, is that right? What have you learned in the series of conversations you've had?
It's a really good and important question. For me, it was interesting. I've been in the advertising business for a long time, and I've been working with all these diverse personalities. Like, the whole ecosystem is built of personalities, right? And so my MO used to be like, hey, look, we're here to do business. They're going to have their opinions. They're going to have their controversies. Let's stay focused on reaching our business objectives. And then you have this collision of values that I think people have become more aware of over the last year or two. And the path of just indiscriminately advertising wherever it's going to work for your business KPIs is very much under it's not sustainable. You can't do that. Your values have to be a part of the conversation. We're really seeing a societal shift, a different way of consumers, employees, stakeholders having expectations for corporations. So for me, I I had to go in and set aside my preconceived notions about like look the other way, count your money, stay focused on what you're here to do. And I started to say, you know what? I think that I am working in a business that is overtly poisoning its customers, and I don't think that anybody knows it, and I don't think that everybody knows it, and I don't think that everybody means to do it. But I think that we have all gotten so caught up in these primal feelings, these tribes. You know, we've sell the fact that these are tribes. You've got a tribal leader who's got the attention. They've got a relationship with this group of thousands, maybe millions of people. And hey, man, when they can turn to that tribe and tell them how great your product is, where are you going to get advertising like that in the world? You can't. Like to get walked into the party by the host and have them spend a minute or two talking about how great you are, like best form advertising possible, right? So that's really important. But at the same time, the barriers to entry came down with the fragmentation of media and the internet, really the open internet, and that started to affect audio. And what we started to see is the strength is also the liability. So anybody can say anything. I can talk to my phone and post this while we're having this conversation. There's no oversight. Nobody's going to stop and go like, hey, how many people are there going to be any lives lost because of what he just said? Right. There's nothing. And I think that we have, so what has, to try to summarize a little bit, like the cost of the attention economy has really been a revelation for me, where getting attention by any means necessary, and that driving what media is available for us to consume is an existential threat to this country, I believe, and the democracy that we're here to protect, and the loss of trust in institutions and in each other, and giving each other the benefit of the doubt. These are real serious problems that are holding back personal relationships, whether that's at a Thanksgiving dinner, it's your friends that you grew up with that you still love. It's who you work with, what companies you can work with. It is everything. It permeates everything that we do. And so what is, the biggest thing for me is to see that everybody's kind of gotten swept up in this. And it's not like one side is problematic and the other side is not. I've come to this realization that everybody's nuts on both sides. I feel like a man without a country most days, because I'm like, I disagree with you and I disagree with you, but I kind of agree with you and I kind of agree with you. And people don't see it that way. They don't hold two contrary thoughts at the same time. So anyway, I'll stop there. Go ahead.
There was a time when that was okay. It feels like we've entered this realm of as you described it. It's like if you're not wearing the right shirt and voting and rooting for the right team, everyone else is verboten. And what's fascinating to think about is how brands can and need to navigate amidst that, right? How, especially in an era when consumers expect more of brands, the trust in as challenging as the trust is in news, the challenge of trust in government traditions and infrastructure is also massively challenged. So consumers are increasingly, if you read the Edelman report, consumers are increasingly putting more trust into brands. And so imagine you're a CMO of an emerging brand, and your younger skewing audience really expects you to step up and do something for the world, right? So now, where do you actually appear in media, right? And I think that what's so interesting in our study was it pointed to the fact that it's okay. Consumers expect we're all consumers of news. If you want to, live day to day, you have to be informed. But I want to bring in Vanessa into this mix, because Vanessa, you've been looking at the how and where news outlets actually fit into the realm of more fact-based, more pure journalism-based, skewing left and right. Let me have you join us on the screen. Vanessa is the CEO and founder of Ad Fontes Media. She's the creator of the media bias chart. She was or is a licensed patent attorney from Denver, Colorado, holds a BA in English and a JD from the University of Denver. What I love to think about is people's backgrounds and how it gets them to where they are. What's fascinating about your background is it's centered on analytical reading, writing, and the ability to analyze context and content is really kind of set you up for the production of the ad fontes chart. Could you share for a minute, like, what was the inspiration for that thing? I wish I could paint the picture for you, but maybe Vanessa, if you would put the image in people's minds so they can imagine how different news outlets fit into that chart.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Eric. The media bias chart, I first created the very first version in 2016, and the reason I created it, it's a two-dimensional graph that plots news sources for overall reliability from top to bottom, and then left to right bias, left to right on that axis. And in the run-up to the 2016 election, I would just it really bothered me how folks would fight online about politics, and in particular with like links from hyper polarizing news sites that weren't convincing to the other side. They'll say, oh, I'm right because of this article, and I'm right because of this article, and they just totally miss each other. I started thinking about my own news consumption, and as a patent attorney, I like to convey complex ideas in both words and pictures, but often, when it's really complex, the pictures help the most. So as a hobby, because I'm a giant nerd, I did this as a hobby, created a map of the media landscape, put it online, and it went massively viral. And I had no plans or intentions for that to be a thing. But over the next 2 years, I heard from a lot of folks on the internet, as you can imagine, good, bad, and ugly. But there was this real draw and this need for conveying this information about this vast news landscape. And when I reflected on why it got so popular, it's because we need news ratings. There hasn't been a class of news ratings before. In the 50s and 60s, if you only have 3 networks and a handful of newspapers and magazines, and then the 80s and 90s, you have some more with cable. But then it really accelerates in the 2000s with digital media, and then in the 2010s, you've got social media on smartphones and just tens of thousands of sources across podcasts and TV and YouTube and all of that, right? So people people feel lost, right? People come to us all the time saying, how do I know what to trust? Yeah. And so we started a company. I started a company around this concept of news ratings for reliability and bias in the beginning of 2018.
So what's fascinating about IAB's research and how it kind of dovetails with what you're doing, our study showed that, and this just is the bubble that everyone tends to live in, news consumers think fake news and misinformation circulates. They don't think fake news is as common within their own preferred news sources. So everyone has this perception that what I'm seeing and reading and viewing is not fake.
We're not the bad guys.
Right, right.
Exactly.
Yeah, right.
So what is that about? What do you think it is?
You want to go first, or you want me to do this one?
Go.
Oh, I what's fascinating is that everyone does agree. Yes, the media is so biased, So they, from all sides, they say yes, we need this because look what the other side's doing. It's terrible.
Right.
Dan?
Yeah.
And I would say, some of it's narcissism, some of it's lack of intellectual honesty, but it's also, look at Congress. Like, everybody hates Congress. Nobody trusts Congress, but they like their congressperson. Like, they're really passionate about their congressperson. Oftentimes it's all the other Congress people that aren't catering to what they want to see and hear and what's a local important issue to that person. So I think that, we talk about filter bubbles and everything like that. And we now live in a world, like, I think the world that we were all born into was different. You had a common understanding. We all saw the same commercials. We saw the same movies. Okay. We don't live in that world anymore. The fragmentation has allowed us to create this virtual reality where you can be fed the stuff that makes sense to you and be told the people out there, they're out to get you. They're going to get you. And so so now we're all in this like tribal warfare state, and it's a disaster.
Well, you know what's fascinating in that Dan, in your roundtable conversation most recently in the recap, someone pointed out that what they kind of find is that there's especially given the role of social media in news distribution, there's this sense that people have that they're invisible. They can say and project whatever they want, not really realizing that what they are saying is directly linked to their entire persona. And what he also pointed out is that critical thinking tends to be the most important. You think twice before you say something batshit crazy.
Right.
But that takes awareness. It also takes having a media diet that is multifaceted. So, so here, going back to the challenge for brands, right? If I'm a brand, what famous sports figure said, "Listen, Republicans buy
Michael Jordan." Yep.
There you go. So what product is purely one stripe of political leaning or another?
Patagonia.
Exactly. So what's your advice, Dan, because you're counseling brands all the time, especially in the podcast space. How are you counseling brands the right way to present their brand image in the context of content that's going to be meaningful for their audience, but to not draw the filter so tightly that they miss the opportunity for reaching more potential consumers?
Yeah, so I think you're touching on a couple of different issues here, and so let me just parse them real quick. One of them is, how do they align themselves with media that is congruent with their values as a business? Right. And that is where, as an agency, meeting Vanessa was a miracle for us, and getting to understand the power of the media bias chart, because now we have an external tool that is not like, everything else that we see, Media Matters, Sleeping Giants, there's watchdog groups, there's people out there, but they're not trying to be intellectually honest. They're not trying to be objective and hold both sides to account. To have a third party that doesn't take a position that's monitoring that and allows us to help our clients and the companies that we advise advertise in a way that is congruent with what they say they believe is life-changing, and it's making a big difference. We are shifting millions of dollars in advertising toward content that is less polarizing, more accurate, less biased. Mm-hmm. And so that's one slice of it. The other piece I think you might be talking about is things like corporations that are weighing in on things like Georgia voting rights and issues like that. And I think, if you were paying attention in 2020 and a little bit since, I think what you started to see is a lot of corporations, mean well. A lot of them are trying to bandwagon their virtue signaling. And guess what? We live in a world that is not going to tolerate virtue signaling. You can't just say something. Like, you have to mean it. You have to follow up with it. And if you try to put the lamb's blood over your doorway, by posting your "we stand in solidarity with you" thing on Instagram and think you've done your job, better that you don't say anything. Better that you get criticized for saying nothing. Hold your tongue unless you're ready to back this up and live this out. And it's so easy to write these checks. There were so many companies making big statements and promises last year. And you know what we're starting to see now is media and other organizations coming in and going, "How you doing on that promise that you made? Let's talk about your follow through on this." And there's accountability for that. So for me, part of it is let's try not to deliberately alienate people. We do live in a very diverse country, and we don't want to cut off half of it arbitrarily. But if you are a business and you're truly committed to a cause that is polarizing, and you're Ben and Jerry's and you're going to make that choice, fine, but you better commit and you better live this out. And you better have a plan and dollars and resources that you're going to manage this like every KPI that you are living for. Because if you're just trying to tap in to whatever the movement is of the moment, you're going to get found out, and you're going to lose credibility, and you're going to lose customers, and your employees are going to get pissed. So be legit and follow through.
Can we talk about solutions? Because Vanessa, I think this is where your work comes in, especially. It's brands at IAB, we've been doing a lot of work. Our tech lab group has been doing a lot of work to make it more possible for brands to, in a more granular way, manage exclusion, inclusion, use content taxonomy to actually inform what brand, what a brand can do at a much more granular level. So instead of blacklisting news, it might be blacklisting, something very specific that their brand doesn't align with.
Right.
So this is where your work comes into play, because how do you think about the supply chain? Because in a way, that metadata that informs an ad appearing in real time, what would you hope to see happen with the ad fontes media bias chart that could make brands smarter about where they can land?
Ultimately, we want brands to be funding good journalism because it's important to society, and we want brands to not be funding misinformation and highly polarizing content. So the measurement that we do, it revolves around that. So just to back up a second, if folks wonder like how we actually make these judgments, right? I mean, from a methodological standpoint, so ad fontes stands for to the source. It's Latin for to the source, because we're doing content analysis. So it's not opinion polling of who do people trust. That's somewhat different. There's lots of good research on that. But if you ask somebody, do you trust MSNBC or do you trust Fox? The answer that they give you tells you more about them than it tells you about the content, right? So we're analyzing the content. We use a nonpartisan content analysis methodology using panels of politically balanced analysts. So for every web news source, we'll take samples of articles, sometimes hundreds of articles, and each article is looked at by somebody who's left, who's right, who's center on the same panel. They'll look at it and they'll compare scores, and their average rolls up to the overall score. So we do that for TV shows. We do that for podcasts and on episode by episode basis. So it's actually like the best of America. Three people balance coming to an agreement about something political. It's great. And that's super important to our methodology, because it needs widespread buy-in, and we rate content on a scale from top to bottom. So the stuff towards the top of our chart is better journalism. Stuff in the middle is okay, fine. We have different reasons why it's there, and then the stuff at the bottom can be problematic, misleading, fake. It's not a binary. It's not real news versus fake news. It's not even news and opinion. That's also a fake binary. And it's not even just left versus right, because many brands are committed to free speech and expression of ideas and wanting to reach broad, diverse audiences, right? And expressing liberal and conservative opinions and advocating for them, most Americans don't have a problem with that. But there's a big difference between that and this extreme, dehumanizing, vilifying the other side as the enemy, like they're evil, they're bad, that's why they're on the other side. That kind of polarization is what people find so destructive. So to distinguish between something that's a little bit biased and then really extremely so is super important. So for different brands, that means different things. Everyone wants to just not get boycotted and yelled at on Twitter for for an ad that they ran next to something super polarizing, right? But that's sort of a basic level. It's reactionary, and we've all seen, somebody says something terrible on a primetime show, and then all the brands run away for like 6 months, and then they kind of come back, right? But there's for every high profile thing that gets boycotted, there are hundreds and thousands of equally polarizing and misleading types of content out there on web, like on digital and CTV and on podcasts that the brands are just blindly running their ads on, right? And we think that it misaligns with a lot of brands' values. So ideally, what we'd want to see is brands that creating specific thresholds, like what is and is not okay in terms of what we'll tolerate for reliability. Like if it's below this line, if it's problematic, we don't want to be there. What is our line for how biased we're going to tolerate, right? For some brands that have run away from news completely, their tolerance is like 0, right? But that means that they're there are so many properties, like so many good news properties that deserve their advertising dollars and funding and have great audiences that they could be reaching, that they're just not advertising on all. At all. So they might have like a small window of like the news landscape that they want to support, but that even in that small window, there's some really great news organizations out there. So we want to get brands back into those, and the ones that are kind of advertising everywhere, just willy nilly. We want to make sure that they're not inadvertently funding polarization, society destroying type of content, because it's bad for everyone.
Yeah. We've been talking, referencing, mostly national news organizations, but everyone lives somewhere, and
Yeah.
local journalism is even more, endangered, I would say. You look at any town you grow up in, and chances are that paper is no longer there. So it really begs the question too of the role. And Dan, you've talked about the role of the fourth estate. I'd like to kind of take us home and with this question, which is, what's the importance of the fourth estate now in the coming year? What's something the industry needs to do to protect it?
Yeah, that's the question, right? So just to recap, fourth estate, old English concept of holding the aristocracy to account. Journalists do that. We have three branches of government. The fourth estate is the fourth group that speaks truth to power, makes them accountable so that people know what's going on, how they're actually, if they're getting their money's worth out of these folks. Now, what's happened is corporations own most media that people consume. They control that. The incentive that drives profits is to get attention. And the best way to get attention is to show fights, right? It's let them all into the Coliseum. So our Coliseum is now, cable news. It's what Jerry Springer was 20, 30 years ago. They might as well be throwing chairs at each other. And everybody's kind of on that spectrum, right? If we can't trust the people whose job is to hold the important people to account, how do we trust any institution? So there's a fundamental lack of trust. Now, what's interesting when you talk about Edelman Trust Barometer is that corporations are the only group, the only institution that is seen as both ethical and competent. And meanwhile, corporations are raising their hand. Business Roundtable says stakeholder capitalism. Yeah, we accept the charge. We're going to do that for you. Now they're starting to find out that if you start wading too far into politics, you're going to get tagged. You're actually not built for that. And not to quote Mitch McConnell on it, but like there is some truth in that. Like you don't want to be too politicized as a brand unless you're in a very specific area.
Right.
But there is accountability and there is an expectation, and consumers are getting savvier and smarter, and they have more tools to understand what the downstream impact is of like who makes your shoes and what is your media doing to you. And what Vanessa's doing is she's finally putting packaging labels on this stuff that, there's been no objective validation for. And so what consumers are now able to do is to say, why are you supporting that media outlet that is doing this damage? And the temptation of a corporation is to react. Everybody wants to react. They think somebody said something on Twitter, we have to say something on Twitter right away. Well, no, you don't. You can think, you can stop, you can pause and have some reflection and investigation. That is still an option. But what is most important is that they look at what are their values. Are you really a purpose-driven brand? And if you are, how about you stop investing and funding media that is destroying the trust in institutions? Why don't we support good journalism that fosters trust? And by doing that, we're trying to move the carrot. We're trying to rewire the incentive structure away from attention by any means necessary to rewarding quality content that will be good for brands, will drive sales, and will also support a strong fourth estate so we can have a country that we can all live in and believe in. So I think it is incumbent on brands to take that role seriously. And that doesn't mean just follow where the peer pressure is coming and just say, well, we're with the good guys, we're not with the bad guys. It's also about saying like, okay, Where is there quality? Where is there an objective, intellectually honest seeking of truth and exposure and accountability that does not play favorites in this country? And let's support that, and we'll all be better for it.
Vanessa, take us home. What is your one thing the industry needs to accomplish this year to make possible that less tribal, more listening brand trust that consumers really want?
I think it's time for brands to get present to the impact that their dollars have on the media landscape. It's about protecting your brand, it's about the brand safety, but beyond that, I mean, brands have so much power. People talk about how to fix these like really deep-seated problems in our country, and this like the news, how our news landscape now, like this crisis of trust is a really it's a complex problem. So you can point to consumers need to do better at determining whether something's misinformation. Educators need to teach media literacy. Social media companies have their role, but what can brands do is like the biggest funders of the media. I think the realization that there is a misinformation and bias impact that your company has on the world and our democracy, and how that affects all of your stakeholders. It affects your shareholders, it affects your customers, it affects your employees. Because if we're polarized as a society, if we don't trust each other, that spills over into your boardrooms and into your employee groups, and you get that strife and that disagreement and inability to solve real problems within your own company. Okay? So stepping out, and people have been thinking about how your company affects the climate and sustainability, how your diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives impact equality across the society. It's the same thing with your misinformation and bias impact on the news landscape. So if that's the one thing that brands can start turning their attention to, it will go a long way into solving some of these things that seem so entrenched. Like I truly believe, I'm an optimist. I think there are brighter days ahead. I think that we're in this these temporary growing pains of this new information age that are we've gone through this as a society, as a humanity before, right? Every time there's new breakthroughs in communication, like with a printing press or the radio, there's some panic about how we now handle all this new information. And ultimately, more information is a net good. However, there's so much of it now that we need to learn how to navigate it as a society. So I think our society can go from, just as a society can go from being illiterate to literate in a generation. You can go from being media illiterate to being media literate, as long as it's something that people focus on and train their attention on improving. So I think we can do it.
Thank you. Thank you both. Dan Granger from Oxford Road, Vanessa Otero from Ad Fontes Media. To learn more and become more educated in exactly these things we're talking about, please visit ieb.com, where you can find and download Understanding Brand Safety and Brand Suitability in a Contemporary Media Landscape. And always feel free to reach out to me, Eric at IAB, for more information as well. Thanks, Vanessa. Thanks, Dan.